The taste of stew had long since lost its appeal to Brennan Harcourt, but he spooned it into his mouth anyway because it kept him alive. And staying alive was all that mattered in the borderlands. It had been happening for weeks now, ever since he had started making Fort Redstone his regular stop between runs into the deep forest. At first, Brennan had thought it was coincidence, or perhaps she simply started serving from his end of the table by chance. But tonight, as he watched her move through the crowded hall with a heavy pot of rabbit stew, he saw her deliberately bypass 3 other empty bowls to fill his first. Her tusks, small and barely visible, caught the firelight as she concentrated on not spilling. She wore a tunic that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify, and her hands bore the calluses and small scars of someone who worked from dawn until well past dark. Brennan set down his spoon and watched more carefully. The girl, she could not have been more than 19 or 20, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. She served every person in the hall, poured drinks, cleared empty bowls, brought more bread from the kitchen, all while the other workers, human workers, sat down in shifts to eat their own meals. The orc girl never sat. She never ate. She just worked and worked and worked, until finally the hall began to empty as men headed to their bunks or back out into the night. The fire burned low. Brennan remained at his table, his bowl long since empty, watching as the girl scrubbed the tables with a rag that had probably once been white. Her movements had grown slower, and there was a tremble in her shoulders that spoke of exhaustion so deep it had settled into her bones. The cook, a heavy-set human woman named Martha who ran the hall with military precision, had disappeared into the kitchen and emerged with her cloak on, clearly finished for the night. She said something to the orc girl that Brennan could not hear, then left through the side door. The girl continued scrubbing. Brennan stood. His chair scraped against the wooden floor, loud in the nearly empty hall, and the girl's head snapped up. Her eyes, an unusual amber color that seemed to glow in the firelight, went wide, and she immediately looked down again, scrubbing harder at a stain that was probably older than Brennan himself. He crossed the hall toward her. She scrubbed faster. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she hunched slightly as if trying to make herself smaller. It reminded him of wild animals he had tracked in the forest, creatures who had learned that humans meant pain. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended after a day of not speaking much to anyone. The girl froze. Her knuckles went white where they gripped the rag. For a long moment she said nothing, and Brennan wondered if she would answer at all. Then, so quietly he had to lean closer to hear, she said, "Grisha." "Grisha," he repeated, tasting the orcish name. It was a good name, solid and strong. "I'm Brennan. I've been coming here for about 2 months now." She nodded once, a tiny movement, still not looking at him. Her hands had started trembling. "I've noticed something," Brennan continued, pulling out a chair and sitting backwards on it so he could face her without towering over her. "You always serve me first, every single time, and I've never once seen you sit down to eat." Grisha's trembling increased. "I serve everyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is my job." "You serve me first," Brennan corrected gently. Why? She did not answer. Instead, she moved to a different section of the table, putting distance between them while still scrubbing. Brennan let her go, but he stood and followed, not aggressively but steadily. "When did you last eat, Grisha?" "I eat," she said quickly. "I am fine." When she scrubbed harder, and Brennan saw a tear fall onto the table, mixing with the water from her rag. "I eat the scraps after everyone is done. Martha allows it. I am grateful." Something hot and angry flared in Brennan's chest. He had seen many injustices in his 32 years. had watched prejudice play out in countless small and large ways, but something about this particular cruelty struck him differently. Perhaps it was the careful way Grisha always made sure his bowl was fullest, or the fact that she worked herself to exhaustion while others ate and rested. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of seeing kindness punished by the accident of birth. "Come with me," he said, not as a request but as a simple statement of what was about to happen. He walked toward the kitchen, and after a hesitation so long he thought she might not follow, he heard her soft footsteps behind him. The kitchen was still warm from the evening's cooking. Large pots sat on the counter, most empty but one still half full of stew. Brennan found a clean bowl cleaner than the one he had eaten from. He noted with dark humor and ladled out a generous portion. He added 3 thick slices of bread, a chunk of cheese from the cold storage, and an apple from the basket near the window. Then he carried the food back out into the hall, set it on the table where he had been sitting, and pulled out the chair across from his. "Sit down," he said. Grisha stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her eyes huge in her face, staring at the bowl of food like it might bite her. I cannot." "Why not? That food is for the workers, the human workers. I get the scraps, I am lucky to get that. I cannot just sit down, Grisha. If Martha finds out, she will be angry. She might tell me to leave, and I have nowhere else to go. I cannot." Brennan stood and walked over to her. She flinched, but he simply took her hand. Her skin was cooler than his, rougher, and her hand was shaking, and led her to the chair. "Sit down," he said again, more gently this time. "Please." Slowly, as if the chair might collapse beneath her, Grisha sat. She perched on the very edge, ready to bolt, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Brennan sat across from her and pushed the bowl closer. "Eat." She stared at the food. A minute passed, then another. Brennan waited. Finally, moving as if in a dream, Grisha picked up the spoon. Her hand shook so badly the first attempt failed to get any stew in her mouth, but the second succeeded. She chewed slowly, and Brennan watched as her eyes closed and a single tear rolled down her green cheek. "When did you last have a real meal?" he asked quietly. Grisha swallowed, opened her eyes. 4 days ago, a merchant left half a meat pie. Martha said I could have it. 4 days. Brennan felt that hot anger flare again. "And before that, I do not remember. A week, maybe. There is usually bread, sometimes spoiled vegetables that are going to be thrown out anyway. It is enough. I am strong, I can work." She said it like a mantra, like something she had told herself over and over to keep going. "I can work. I can survive. I am strong." And she was strong. Brennan could see the lean muscle in her arms, the breadth of her shoulders, but strength had limits, and she was pushing well past hers. "Eat all of it," Brennan said. "All of it, Grisha. And then you are going to tell me why you always serve me first." She ate. At first she took small, careful bites as if she still expected someone to snatch the bowl away. But as no one came, as Brennan just sat across from her in silence, she began to eat faster, with the desperate intensity of someone who did not know when food might come again. She finished the stew, ate all 3 slices of bread with the cheese, and bit into the apple with a small sound of pleasure that made Brennan's heart ache. When she finally set down the apple core, her bowl empty and spotless, she looked marginally less like a ghost. Some color had come into her face, and the trembling in her hands had eased. She still would not quite meet his eyes, but when she spoke, her voice was stronger. "You never spit at me," she said. Brennan blinked. "What?" "The first time you came here, 2 months and 3 weeks ago, I served you stew just like tonight. You said thank you. You did not spit at me or call me greenskin or make a sign against evil. You just said thank you, like I was a person." She twisted her hands together. "The second time you came, you remembered me. You smiled. No one smiles at me except sometimes Martha when she is in a good mood. The third time you asked how I was, and I did not know what to say because no one had ever asked me that before." Her amber eyes finally lifted to his, and Brennan saw in them a loneliness so profound it made his chest tight. "So I serve you first," Grisha continued, "because you are kind. Because in a world that has never been kind to me, you are the one good thing. And I thought if I served you first, if I made sure your bowl was always full and your water was always fresh, maybe you would keep coming back. Maybe I would keep getting to see that someone in this world does not hate me just for existing." The hall was silent, except for the crackle of the dying fire. Brennan had tracked dangerous animals, had survived blizzards and floods, had once talked a rabid wolf away from a child by staying calm and still, but he had no idea what to say in the face of such raw honesty. So he did what felt right. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Grisha gasped, and for a moment he thought she would pull away. But she did not. Instead, her fingers curled slightly under his palm, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a tilting world. "You should not have to earn basic kindness, Grisha," Brennan said. "You should not have to go hungry while others feast. You work harder than anyone here, and you deserve to be treated with respect." "I am an orc," she said simply, as if that explained everything, and in the borderlands it did. Brennan knew the prejudices, had grown up with them, had been taught that orcs were monsters, savages, less than human. It had taken years of living rough, of encountering orc families in the deep woods who were just trying to survive like everyone else, for him to unlearn those lies. But most people never did. Most people clung to their hatred because it was easier than questioning everything they had been taught. "You are a person," Brennan countered. "A person who deserves to eat and rest and be seen. And from now on, when I come to Fort Redstone, you are going to sit and eat a real meal with me, not scraps. A real meal. Do you understand?" Grisha's eyes filled with tears. "You will leave soon. You always do. You come for a few days and then you go back into the forest for weeks. And I will still be here, and Martha will still feed me scraps, and it will be just like it was before." "Then things need to change," Brennan said, and even as he said it, he was not entirely sure what he meant. He was a scout and trapper, not a revolutionary. He had no authority in Fort Redstone, no wealth to speak of beyond what he made selling furs and serving as guide to occasional merchants. But looking at Grisha, at the hope warring with despair in her eyes, he knew he could not just walk away, not this time. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "When the evening meal is served, I will be here and you will sit with me and eat. Understood?" She nodded, not quite believing but wanting to. "I will try. Not try. Do it." He squeezed her hand once, then released it and stood. "I need to get some sleep. I am heading out at dawn. But I will be back in 10 days, and I expect to see you looking healthier than this." He left her sitting at the table, and as he walked toward the bunk rooms, he heard her whisper, "Thank you." It was the softest sound, but it followed him all the way into sleep. Over the next weeks, Brennan made good on his word. He returned to Fort Redstone every 10 days or so, sometimes sooner if the weather was bad or he finished his work early. And every time, without fail, he found Grisha in the communal hall and made her sit down to eat with him. At first she was terrified, constantly glancing toward the kitchen as if expecting Martha to storm out and berate her. But Martha never did. The older woman watched from the kitchen doorway sometimes, her expression unreadable, but she said nothing. The other workers noticed. How could they not? It started whispers, then open muttering. A few men made crude comments that Brennan shut down with a single cold look. Others simply avoided the table where he sat with Grisha, as if proximity to an orc might contaminate them. Brennan did not care. He had spent too many years alone in the wilderness to care much about the opinions of people whose greatest adventure was a walk to the privy in the dark. What he did care about was the slow transformation in Grisha. The first real meal became a second, then a third. The hollows under her cheekbones filled in slightly. The tremble disappeared from her hands. She began to meet his eyes when they spoke, and eventually she even smiled, a small, hesitant thing that revealed her tusks and made her self-conscious, but a smile nonetheless. They talked during those meals. At first, the conversations were stilted, limited to safe topics like the weather or the quality of the stew. But gradually, Grisha opened up. She told him about her childhood in an orc clan far to the north, how she had been cast out at 16 for speaking against the clan war chief who wanted to raid human settlements. She had spent 3 years wandering alone, doing odd jobs where she could, usually going hungry, often facing violence. Fort Redstone was the longest she had stayed anywhere, and only because Martha, for all her gruffness, had been the first human to offer her steady work instead of a knife in the dark. "I send her most of my pay," Grisha admitted one evening, her voice quiet. "She lets me sleep in the storage room behind the kitchen. It is warm and dry. I have never been so lucky." Brennan, who had been paid in silver coins and could afford a real bed in the bunk rooms, felt that familiar anger rise. Lucky. She thought she was lucky to sleep in a storage room and eat garbage while working herself to exhaustion. He wanted to rage against the injustice of it, but he knew that would only make Grisha defensive. She had built her survival on gratitude for scraps. Challenging that meant challenging the entire framework she used to make sense of her life. So instead, he told her about himself. About growing up in a farming community 300 miles south, the youngest of 5 brothers. About how he had never quite fit, had always been drawn to the forest instead of the fields. About the mentor who had taught him to track and hunt and read the wilderness like a language. About the quiet joy he found in being alone among the trees, answerable to no one, beholden to nothing but his own skill and the turning of seasons. "You never get lonely?" Grisha asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. They had long since finished eating, but neither had moved to leave. The hall was nearly empty, just a few trappers playing cards by the fire. "Sometimes," Brennan admitted, "but loneliness is different from being alone. I have been lonely in crowded rooms. I have been perfectly content by myself in a snowstorm. It depends on whether you feel seen, I think." "Whether you matter to someone," Grisha nodded slowly. "I have been alone for a long time, but I have always been lonely until—" She trailed off, her green cheeks darkening slightly. "Until recently." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, something warm and terrifying and precious. Brennan felt his heartbeat quicken. He told himself it was just friendship, just basic compassion for someone who had been treated badly. But he knew, deep down, that it was becoming something more. Winter came to the borderlands, and with it came hardship. The forest grew treacherous with ice and snow. Game became scarce, and the trappers who relied on pelts for income grew desperate and mean. Fort Redstone's population swelled with people seeking shelter, and the communal hall ran low on supplies. Martha started serving thinner stews, smaller portions. The grumbling among the workers grew louder. Brennan came in from a particularly brutal week in the forest, half frozen and exhausted, to find the hall in chaos. A group of trappers surrounded the serving area, shouting at Martha, who stood with her arms crossed and her face like stone. Brennan pushed through the crowd to see what the problem was, and his stomach sank when he spotted Grisha cowering behind Martha, a metal ladle clutched in her hands like a weapon. "She is taking food meant for us," one of the trappers yelled. a big man named Garrett who Brennan had never liked. I saw her with a full bowl. While we are being told to make do with half portions, the greenskin is eating our supplies. I gave her that food, Martha snapped. She works 3 times harder than any of you lazy dogs, and I will feed her if I please. You will feed humans first. Garrett shot back. We pay for our meals. What does she pay? Nothing. She is stealing from us, the crowd murmured agreement. Brennan saw the ugly mood forming, the way men shifted their weight and clenched their fists. Mob violence was a spark away, and Grisha was the kindling. He pushed forward, shouldering men aside until he stood between Garrett and Martha. Enough, Brennan said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Grisha eats because I pay for her meals. She is not taking anything from you, Garrett sneered. You paying to feed an orc. What's she warming your bed too? Brennan hit him. It was not a decision so much as a reflex, his fist connecting with Garrett's jaw with a satisfying crack. The big man went down hard, more from surprise than the force of the blow, and the hall went silent. Anyone else want to insult her? Brennan asked pleasantly, flexing his bruised knuckles. No one spoke. He turned to Martha. From now on, any meal Grisha eats, charge it to my account. I will pay double if I have to. She works for her keep, same as anyone here. Martha studied him with sharp eyes, then nodded once. Fair enough. Now, everyone get out of my hall before I bar the lot of you for disturbing the peace. The crowd dispersed, shooting dark looks at Brennan and Grisha as they went. Garrett picked himself up off the floor, holding his jaw, and left without another word. When the hall had cleared, Brennan finally turned to look at Grisha. She was still behind Martha, still holding the ladle, her amber eyes enormous in her pale face. You did not have to do that, she whispered. Yes, I did, Brennan said. He took the ladle gently from her hands and set it aside. Are you hurt? She shook her head, just frightened. They were so angry, I thought. She swallowed hard. I thought they might hurt Martha. Not herself, Brennan noted. She had been frightened for Martha, the woman who fed her scraps and let her sleep in a storage room. Grisha's capacity for loyalty astounded him. He wanted to tell her she deserved better, that she should save her loyalty for people who valued her, but he knew she would not understand. Not yet. Come on, he said instead. Let us get some food in you before I pass out. It has been a long week. They ate together, as had become their custom, but the mood was subdued. Grisha picked at her food, and Brennan could see the fear had not left her. He wanted to fix it, to make promises that she would be safe, but he had no authority here. He was just a scout who happened to have a conscience. In a few days, he would head back into the forest, and Grisha would be here alone, surrounded by people who resented her existence. Unless, the thought came to him fully formed, reckless and impossible, and somehow completely right. He turned it over in his mind through the rest of the meal, examining it from every angle. It was insane. It would change everything. But the more he considered it, the more sense it made. Grisha, he said as they finished eating, how would you feel about leaving Fort Redstone? She looked up sharply. Leaving? To go where? With me? The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Grisha's spoon clattered into her bowl. With you, into the forest, I do not understand. Brennan leaned forward, his heart pounding. I have a cabin. It is deep in the wilderness, about 3 weeks north of here. I built it myself 5 years ago as a base for the longer trapping runs. It is small, but it is warm and dry, and there is plenty of game nearby. I could use help maintaining it, processing pelts, preserving meat. The work is hard, but... He hesitated, then plunged ahead. But you would eat real meals every day, you would have a real bed, and you would not have to face people like Garrett ever again. Grisha stared at him like he had started speaking a foreign language. You want me to come live with you, in your cabin? Why? Because you deserve better than this, Brennan said simply. Because you are good and kind and you work yourself to death for people who give you nothing in return. Because I—" He stopped, the next words catching in his throat. "Because I care about you. Because somewhere along the way, making sure you ate became the most important part of my day. Because I am falling in love with you, and I am only just now realizing it." He could not say those things. Not yet. It was too much, too soon, and she would think he was lying or trying to take advantage of her. So instead, he said, "Because I could use a partner. The wilderness is dangerous alone, and I trust you." "You trust me," Grisha repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "You would trust an orc to watch your back in the wild. I would trust you with my life." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. For a moment, Brennan thought she would flee, but instead she just stood there, hands clenched at her sides, breathing hard. "No one has ever trusted me with anything except scrubbing floors and hauling garbage. You are either the kindest man I have ever met or the biggest fool." "Probably both," Brennan said with a small smile. "What do you say?" Grisha looked around the hall, at the rough tables and dying fire, at the doorway to the kitchen where she had spent countless hours in backbreaking labor for scraps, and a corner to sleep in. Then she looked back at Brennan, and he saw the exact moment she decided to take the leap. "When do we leave?" They left 3 days later, as soon as Brennan had finished his business at the fort and gathered supplies for the journey north. Martha was surprisingly understanding when Grisha told her, even pressing a small pouch of coins into the orc girl's hands back pay that Martha had apparently been saving, though she had never mentioned it before. "You are a good worker," the older woman said gruffly. "Do not let anyone tell you different." The journey north was hard. Winter in the borderlands was unforgiving, and they had to move carefully to avoid both the weather and the bandits who preyed on travelers. Brennan taught Grisha how to read tracks, how to move quietly through the forest, how to tell safe plants from poisonous ones. She learned quickly, her natural strength and endurance proving invaluable. At night, they made camp and sat close to the fire, and Brennan told her stories about the wilderness while she listened with rapt attention. She asked questions constantly, hungry for knowledge in a way that surprised him. She wanted to know the names of trees, the habits of animals, the meanings of different cloud formations. She had spent years just surviving, and now, with the promise of stability ahead, she wanted to understand the world around her. Brennan found himself enjoying the teaching, rediscovering his own love of the wilderness through her eyes. They reached the cabin on a gray afternoon 3 weeks into their journey. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, a sturdy structure of logs and stone with a good chimney and shuttered windows. Smoke damage on one side showed where a fire had once threatened it, but Brennan had repaired the damage and added reinforcements. It was not large, just one main room with a sleeping loft, a small storage room and a lean-to for firewood, but it was solid and well made. Grisha stood in the clearing, staring at the cabin with an expression Brennan could not quite read. "This is yours?" she asked. "Ours now," Brennan corrected, pushing open the door. "Come on. Let us get a fire going before we freeze." The interior was cold and dusty from disuse, but it was intact. Brennan had left it stocked with basic supplies, and soon he had a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Grisha moved around the space slowly, touching things with gentle fingers: the handmade table, the shelves lined with tools and preserving jars, the thick furs piled on the bed frame. Her bed frame now. "Where will you sleep?" she asked suddenly, turning to face him. Brennan pointed to the loft. "Up there. I built it for storage, but there is room for a bedroll. You take the main bed." "I cannot take your bed. This is your cabin." "Our cabin," he said again, more firmly. "And you are taking the bed. I am lighter, better suited for climbing up and down from the loft. No arguments." She looked like she wanted to argue anyway, but exhaustion won out. They had been traveling hard for weeks, and the warmth of the fire was already making her eyelids droop. Brennan heated some preserved stew from his stores, made her eat a full bowl, and then sent her to bed. She was asleep almost before her head hit the furs, her face finally relaxed and peaceful. Brennan stayed by the fire a while longer, watching the play of shadows on the walls and trying not to think about how right it felt to have her here. He had lived alone for so long, had convinced himself he preferred it that way, but the cabin already felt different with Grisha in it, warmer, fuller, like it had finally become what it was always meant to be. He climbed into the loft eventually and lay awake for a long time, listening to the soft sound of her breathing below and wondering what he had gotten himself into. Life in the cabin fell into a rhythm quickly. Brennan woke before dawn each day to check his trap lines, returning by mid-morning with whatever game he had caught. Grisha took to the work of processing the catches with surprising skill, her strong hands making quick work of skinning and butchering. She learned to scrape and stretch hides to smoke meat, to render fat for candles and soap. The work was hard and often unpleasant, but she never complained. She just worked steadily, efficiently, and Brennan found himself more grateful for her presence every day. He taught her to hunt, starting with a simple bow and working up to tracking larger game. She had a natural eye for it, and her orc strength meant she could draw a heavier bow than most humans. Within a month, she brought down her first deer, and the look of pride on her face made Brennan's chest ache with an emotion he was not quite ready to name. They ate well. Brennan made sure of that, cooking hearty meals twice a day and insisting Grisha eat her fill. She had been underfed for so long that it took time for her body to adjust, but gradually she filled out. Her face grew rounder, her arms thicker with muscle. She moved with more confidence, more ease, as if finally believing she had a right to take up space in the world. The winter deepened. Snow piled high around the cabin, and there were days when going outside at all was treacherous. On those days, they stayed inside and worked on indoor tasks, repairing equipment, sewing clothes, carving new arrows. They talked long, rambling conversations about everything and nothing. Grisha told him about orc culture, the clan structures and traditions that she had been exiled from. Brennan told her about human society, the politics and prejudices that had driven him to the wilderness in the first place. "You miss it?" Grisha asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her hands busy sewing a tear in his spare cloak. "Civilization, I mean, other people." Brennan considered the question. "Sometimes I miss certain things, fresh bread from a bakery, music, the sound of children playing, but people," he shook his head. "Most people make me tired. They are so caught up in things that do not matter: who has more money, who wore what to the market, what the neighbors are doing. Out here, everything is simple. You work to survive, and if you do the work well, you survive. There is honor in that." "Is that why you helped me?" Grisha asked, not looking up from her sewing. "Because you saw I was working hard but not surviving anyway." "I helped you because it was the right thing to do," Brennan said, "and because—" He hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "Because I liked you. From the first time you smiled at me, I liked you. You have goodness in you, Grisha. Real goodness, not the fake kind people put on to look respectable. I wanted to know you better." Grisha's hands stilled. "And now that you know me better, now I like you even more." She set down the cloak and finally looked at him, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "I have never had a friend before. I do not know how to be one. But I am glad you brought me here, Brennan. I am happier than I have ever been." "Good," he said, his voice rough. "You deserve to be happy." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling between them, and Brennan allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, this could work. They could build a life here, the two of them, away from the prejudices and cruelties of the wider world. It would not be easy, but then, nothing worthwhile ever was. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in stages, revealing the muddy earth beneath. The forest came alive with new growth and returning animals. Brennan expanded his trap lines, and Grisha went with him more often, learning the terrain and proving herself an invaluable partner. She had good instincts, a knack for spotting things he might have missed. Together, they were more efficient than he had ever been alone. But spring also meant the return of dangers that winter had kept at bay. Bandits came out of their winter hideouts, hungry and desperate. Territorial predators emerged to reclaim their hunting grounds. And one warm afternoon in early spring, both dangers converged on the cabin at once. Brennan had been checking the northern trap line while Grisha stayed behind to work on tanning some hides. He was on his way back, moving through the forest with the easy confidence of long practice, when he heard shouts from the direction of the cabin. His blood went cold. He ran, crashing through underbrush with no care for stealth, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into the clearing to find 3 men surrounding Grisha. She had her back to the cabin wall, a skinning knife in one hand and a piece of firewood in the other, her face set in a snarl. The men were spreading out, clearly planning to rush her from multiple angles. Brennan recognized the tactic. These were not amateurs. They were experienced bandits, likely scouting for cabins to raid. "Back away from her," Brennan called, unslinging his bow and knocking an arrow in one smooth motion. "Now." The men spun to face him. The leader, a scarred man with a patchy beard, laughed. "Well, well, the orc has a keeper. Tell you what, friend, walk away and we will make this quick for her. Stay and you can watch. Your choice." Brennan's arrow was in the man's chest before he finished speaking. The bandit looked down at it in surprise, tried to speak, and collapsed. The other 2 men stood frozen for a critical second, and in that second, Grisha moved. She threw the piece of firewood with orcish strength, catching one man in the temple and dropping him instantly. The 3rd man turned to run, and Brennan's second arrow took him in the back. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by Brennan's harsh breathing. He lowered his bow and ran to Grisha, who was still pressed against the cabin wall, her knife raised. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands hovering over her shoulders, afraid to touch her without permission but desperate to make sure she was unharmed. "I am fine," she said, but her voice shook. "They came from the west, said they smelled smoke and wanted to see who was here. When they saw me alone, they—" She swallowed hard. "They said things. I told them to leave. They laughed." Rage, pure and bright, flared through Brennan. "I should not have killed them so quickly," he said through clenched teeth. Grisha dropped the knife and the firewood and, to Brennan's shock, threw her arms around him. She was shaking all over, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush. He wrapped his arms around her instinctively, holding her tight, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. "I was so scared," she whispered into his shoulder. "Not for me, for you. I thought if they hurt me, you would come back and try to avenge me, and they would kill you, and it would be my fault. Grisha, no, I could not bear it if something happened to you because of me. I could not bear it." Brennan pulled back just enough to look at her face. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears, her expression raw with emotion. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct and need, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. For a heartbeat, she went rigid with surprise. Then she melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, kissing him back with a ferocity that stole his breath. She tasted like the wild honey they had found last week, sweet and unexpected, and Brennan thought distantly that he could kiss her forever and never get enough. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grisha stared at him with wonder. "Why did you do that?" "Because I have been wanting to for months," Brennan admitted. "Because you are brave and strong and good, and he stopped, the words too big, too frightening to say out loud. "Say it," Grisha whispered. "Please." "I love you," Brennan said, the words feeling like both a confession and a relief. "I love you, Grisha. I think I have loved you since the first time I made you sit down and eat, maybe even before that." Grisha made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "I love you too. I did not know what it was at first, this feeling I got when you smiled at me, when you spoke to me like I mattered. But I know now, it is love. I love you, Brennan." He kissed her again, softer this time, reverent. Then reality intruded in the form of 3 dead bodies in his clearing. He sighed and rested his forehead against hers. "We need to deal with this. Check them for any papers or marks that might tell us if they are part of a larger group. Then we need to bury them far from here and hope no one comes looking." Grisha nodded, pulling back reluctantly. "I will help." They worked together as the sun climbed higher, searching the bodies and finding enough to confirm these were independent bandits, not part of an organized gang. They buried them in the forest and disguised the graves with brush and fallen branches. It was grim work, but necessary. The wilderness had its own justice, and sometimes that justice was swift and final. That night they sat by the fire, closer than they had ever sat before. Brennan had his arm around Grisha's shoulders, and she leaned against him, her head on his chest. The fear of the day had passed, but it had left something in its wake, a bone-deep certainty that they belonged together, that they would protect each other against whatever came. "What happens now?" Grisha asked quietly. "We cannot pretend we are just partners anymore. We cannot sleep in separate beds and act like this is just a business arrangement." "No, we cannot," Brennan agreed. "What do you want to happen?" She tilted her head back to look at him. "I want to be with you, truly with you. But I am an orc and you are human, and the world will not accept us. If we ever go back to civilization, they will hate us for this. They will call you a traitor and me a seducer. They will make our lives miserable." "Then we do not go back," Brennan said simply. "We stay here. We build our life in the wilderness. We do not need the rest of the world, Grisha. We only need each other. You would give up everything for me, your people, your culture, any chance of a normal life." "I gave up on a normal life years ago," Brennan said. "And as for my people, they stopped being my people the moment I saw how they treated you and others like you. I chose you, Grisha. I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life, if you will have me." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, I will have you. I will choose you too, every day, always." They moved her things down from the main bed that night, and Brennan came down from the loft. They lay together under the firs, holding each other, and for the first time in either of their lives, neither was alone. The seasons turned. Spring became summer, summer became fall, and fall began its slow slide toward winter again. Brennan and Grisha worked the land and the forest, building a life that was simple but deeply fulfilling. They hunted together, cooked together, laughed and argued and made love. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's quirks and habits. Brennan discovered that Grisha sang while she worked, low, orcish songs that were beautiful in their strangeness. Grisha learned that Brennan talked in his sleep, mumbling about trap lines and weather patterns. They were happy. Deeply, profoundly happy in a way that seemed almost dangerous, as if the universe might notice and decide to correct the imbalance. But the months passed without disaster, and gradually, they began to relax into the idea that maybe, just maybe, they could have this. They could have each other and a life together, even if the rest of the world never understood. The first snow of the new winter came on a clear, cold night. They stood outside the cabin, watching the flakes fall silver in the moonlight, and Brennan was struck by how beautiful Grisha looked, her green skin pale in the moonlight, her breath pluming in the cold air, her eyes reflecting the stars. He had never been a man given to poetry or grand gestures, but in that moment he wanted to give her something that matched the enormity of what he felt. "Marry me," he said. Grisha turned to look at him, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. "What? Marry me? I know we cannot go to a temple or have a priest perform a ceremony, but we can make our own vows. We can promise ourselves to each other before the forest and the sky and whatever gods might be listening. Marry me, Grisha." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she started to cry, big silent tears that rolled down her cheeks and froze in the cold air. "You would marry an orc. You would bind yourself to me in the eyes of the gods. I am already bound to you in every way that matters," Brennan said. "This would just make it official." "Yes," Grisha said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Brennan, I will marry you. I will be your wife, and you will be my husband, and we will be bound together until death." They spoke their vows right there in the falling snow, with no witnesses but the trees and the stars. Brennan promised to honor and protect her, to provide for her, to love her in sickness and health, in plenty and in want, until his last breath. Grisha promised the same, her orcish accent making the human words sound exotic and beautiful. They exchanged no rings, neither of them had such things, but Brennan took his hunting knife and made a small cut on his palm, and Grisha did the same. They pressed their bleeding hands together, mingling their blood, and in that moment they were married in the oldest way either of their people knew. They went inside afterward and made love by the firelight, gentle and passionate by turns, and when they finally slept, wrapped in each other's arms, Brennan thought he had never been so completely at peace. Winter settled in hard and deep. Brennan and Grisha spent long days inside the cabin, working on small projects and enjoying each other's company. Grisha taught Brennan some of the orcish language, and he taught her to read and write in the human script. They played games, told stories, and on particularly cold nights, just lay together and listened to the wind howl outside their warm sanctuary. It was on one such night, with the fire burned low and Grisha drowsing against his chest, that Brennan allowed himself to truly reflect on how far they had both come. A year ago, Grisha had been starving and alone, working herself to death for scraps in Fort Redstone. He had been a solitary scout, convinced he preferred isolation to human company. Now they were married, building a life together in the wilderness, and Brennan could not imagine going back to the way things had been. She had become the center of his world, the reason he got up every morning and the person he thought of last before sleep. She was his partner, his lover, his wife in all but legal standing, and he would die before he let anyone take her from him. "What are you thinking about?" Grisha murmured, half asleep. "How lucky I am," Brennan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am the lucky one," she countered, snuggling closer. "You saved me, Brennan, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he corrected gently. "I was just surviving before you. Now I am living." She tilted her head back to kiss him, slow and sweet, and they stayed like that until the fire burned to embers and sleep finally claimed them both. The second winter in the cabin was easier than the first, because they knew what to expect and had prepared accordingly. They had stockpiled more food, more firewood, more supplies for the long months of confinement. And they had each other, which made even the darkest, coldest days bearable. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it came a surprise. Grisha had been feeling ill for weeks, and they had both attributed it to some minor sickness or perhaps just the toll of winter. But when her belly began to swell, they realized the truth. She was pregnant. The discovery brought joy and terror in equal measure. Joy because they both wanted children, had talked about it in hypothetical terms. Terror because childbirth was dangerous under the best circumstances, and they were alone in the wilderness with no access to a healer or midwife. If something went wrong, Brennan would be helpless to fix it. But Grisha refused to be afraid. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she said practically, one hand resting on her growing belly. "I am strong, I will be fine, and you will help me." "I do not know how to help with childbirth," Brennan said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "Then we will figure it out together," Grisha said firmly. "We always do." So Brennan prepared as best he could. He questioned every woman he encountered on his rare trips to distant trading posts, piecing together information about what to expect and how to help. He gathered supplies: clean cloth, hot water, sharp knives sterilized in flame. He built a larger bed, more comfortable for a pregnant woman. He hunted and preserved more food than ever before, determined that Grisha would want for nothing. And Grisha bloomed. Her pregnancy suited her, filling her with an energy and happiness that was radiant. She sang constantly, her hands always busy with some project: sewing tiny clothes, carving a wooden cradle, preparing the cabin for the new arrival. She talked to her belly, telling the baby about the forest and the cabin and the father who loved them both so much. "What if the child is more orc than human?" she asked one evening as they lay in bed, her head on his chest. "What if people see them and hate them just for existing?" "Then the child will stay here with us, where people cannot hate them," Brennan said. "We will teach them to be strong and kind and proud of who they are. And if anyone ever tries to hurt them, they will have to go through both of us first." Grisha laughed, a sound of pure happiness. "Our child will be so loved. They will never know what it is like to go hungry or be afraid. We will give them everything we never had." "Yes," Brennan agreed, his hand splaying protectively over her belly. "We will." The baby came on a warm summer night, arriving with the kind of speed and efficiency that characterized everything Grisha did. Brennan helped as best he could, following her instructions even when he was terrified he would do something wrong. But Grisha was strong, just as she had always been, and when the baby finally emerged, wailing and red and perfect, Brennan wept with relief and joy. "A girl," Grisha said, exhausted but radiant, holding the baby against her chest. "We have a daughter." Brennan looked at the tiny creature, so small and vulnerable, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. She had Grisha's green skin, though lighter, and tiny nubs where tusks would eventually grow. Her eyes, when they opened, were a startling blue. His eyes. She was perfect, a blend of both of them, proof that love could overcome any barrier. "What should we name her?" he asked, stroking one finger down the baby's soft cheek. "Something that means hope," Grisha said, "because she is all of our hopes made real." They named her Alina, a name that meant bright light in the human tongue. She was the light of their lives, the physical embodiment of their love. They doted on her shamelessly, taking turns holding her and marveling at her tiny fingers and toes. She nursed well and grew quickly, a healthy baby who already showed signs of her mother's strength. Raising a child in the wilderness was not easy, but Brennan and Grisha managed. They took turns caring for Alina while the other worked, and they adapted their routines to accommodate her needs. The cabin, which had once been a refuge for two, became a home for a family. They built an addition, a small room where Alina could sleep safely, and filled it with handmade toys and soft furs. Alina grew, as children do, passing from infant to toddler to small child with startling speed. She learned to walk early, her orcish strength giving her an advantage, and she inherited both her mother's fearlessness and her father's curiosity. The forest became her playground, and she learned its ways as naturally as breathing. By the time she was 4, she could identify animal tracks, knew which plants were safe to eat, and could move through the woods as quietly as her parents. She was also fiercely loved, not just by Brennan and Grisha, but by the handful of trusted friends they had made over the years. There were a few trappers who came through regularly, men who had learned to see past prejudice and appreciate Grisha for who she was. They brought news of the outside world and gifts for Alina, and they respected the life Brennan and Grisha had built. One such friend was Thomas, an older trapper who had taken a liking to the unconventional family. He visited twice a year, always bringing some treat or toy for Alina, and he was the one who finally asked the question that Brennan had been dreading. "What will you do when she grows older?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching Alina chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "She is a smart girl, bright as any I have seen. She will want to know about the world beyond these trees eventually. Will you keep her here forever?" Brennan exchanged a glance with Grisha. They had talked about this, late at night when Alina was asleep, their voices low and worried. "We will let her choose," he said finally. "When she is old enough to understand what it means to be different, what it means to be part orc in a world that hates orcs, we will tell her everything. And then we will let her decide if she wants to stay here or see what else is out there. And if she chooses to leave," Thomas pressed, "then we will support her," Grisha said quietly. "We will give her everything we know, every skill we can teach her, and we will trust that she is strong enough to face whatever comes. But we will also make sure she knows she always has a home here with us, no matter what." Thomas nodded slowly. "You are good parents. That girl is lucky to have you." As if summoned by the praise, Alina came running over, her hands cupped carefully around something. "Look," she said excitedly, opening her hands to reveal a firefly sitting on her palm, its abdomen glowing softly. "I caught one. But I am going to let it go, because Mama says all things should be free." "Very wise," Brennan said, ruffling her dark hair. "Go on, let it go." Alina opened her hands and the firefly flew off into the darkness. She watched it go with satisfaction, then climbed into Grisha's lap and snuggled close. "Will you tell me a story, Mama?" "Of course," Grisha said, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "What kind of story do you want?" "A story about brave people who are different but still do good things," Alina said promptly. Brennan and Grisha exchanged a smile over her head. "I think I know just the story," Grisha said, and began to tell Alina about a human scout and an orc girl who learned that being different was not something to fear but something to celebrate. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and Alina's steady growth. She was 7 when the next great challenge came, arriving in the form of a wounded traveler who stumbled into their clearing one autumn afternoon. Brennan was out checking trap lines, and Grisha was inside preparing dinner when Alina came running into the cabin. "Mama, there is a lady outside." "She is hurt." Grisha grabbed her knife and went outside cautiously. Sure enough, a woman lay crumpled at the edge of the clearing, her clothes torn and bloody. She was human, middle-aged, with graying hair and a face drawn with pain. Grisha approached carefully, aware that this could be a trap, but the woman's injuries looked real. She had been badly beaten, and there was an arrow embedded in her shoulder. "Please," the woman gasped when she saw Grisha. Then her eyes focused on the green skin and tusks, and she flinched. "Please do not hurt me. I am already dying." "I am not going to hurt you," Grisha said, kneeling beside her, "but I need to get you inside. Alina, run and find your father. Tell him we need him now." Alina took off like a shot, and Grisha carefully lifted the woman. She was lighter than she looked, clearly half-starved, and Grisha got her inside and onto the bed with relative ease. She was assessing the injuries, trying to figure out where to start, when Brennan burst through the door with Alina on his heels. "What happened?" he demanded, then stopped short when he saw the woman on their bed. "I do not know. She just appeared," Grisha said. "She has been beaten and there is an arrow in her shoulder. Help me." Together they worked to stabilize the woman. Brennan removed the arrow, a dangerous operation but necessary, while Grisha prepared clean bandages and a poultice to prevent infection. Alina hovered nearby, watching everything with wide eyes, learning despite the danger. The woman, whose name they learned was Margaret, had been traveling with a merchant caravan when they were attacked by bandits. She had managed to escape, but had gotten lost in the forest and collapsed from her injuries. She was weak and feverish, and for the first few days, Brennan was not sure she would survive. But Grisha nursed her with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything. She sat up through the nights, changing bandages and forcing water between Margaret's lips. She made broth and spooned it into the woman's mouth, one small sip at a time. And slowly, Margaret began to recover. When she was finally well enough to talk, Margaret looked at Grisha with something like awe. "You saved my life. An orc saved my life. I do not understand." "Because you needed help," Grisha said simply. "That is reason enough." Margaret began to cry. "I have spent my whole life believing orcs were monsters, that you were all savages who would kill humans on sight, but you have shown me more kindness than my own people ever did. I am ashamed." "Do not be ashamed," Grisha said gently. "Just learn. And when you return to the world, tell people what you learned. Tell them that orcs can be kind, that they can love and heal just like anyone else. Maybe if enough people learn, things will change." Margaret stayed with them for 3 weeks, until she was strong enough to travel. During that time, she learned about Brennan and Grisha's unlikely love story, about Alina and the life they had built in the wilderness. She watched them together and saw the deep respect and affection they had for each other. And when she finally left, tearfully grateful and promising to spread word of their kindness, Brennan hoped she would keep that promise. "You think she will?" he asked Grisha that night as they lay in bed, Alina asleep in her own room. "Do you think she will tell people about us?" "I do not know," Grisha admitted, "but I hope so. I hope that someday families like ours will not have to hide in the wilderness. I hope that someday human and orc children can play together without fear. That is the world I want for Alina." "That is the world I want for all of us," Brennan said, pulling her close. "And maybe it starts with people like Margaret, who see the truth and are brave enough to speak it." Alina was 10 when she first asked the question directly. They were sitting around the dinner table, a meal of venison and roasted vegetables between them, when she looked up and said, "Why do we live out here alone? Why do we not live in a town with other people?" Brennan and Grisha exchanged a long look. They had known this day would come, had prepared for it as best they could. But it was still painful to have to explain the ugliness of the world to their innocent daughter. "Because the world is not always kind to people who are different," Grisha said carefully. "Your father is human and I am an orc. Most people believe humans and orcs should not be together. They think it is wrong, unnatural. If we lived in a town, they would treat us badly. They might even try to hurt us." Alina frowned, processing this. "But that does not make sense. You love each other. Love is good, is it not?" "Love is very good," Brennan said. "But not everyone sees it that way. People fear what they do not understand, and they often turn that fear into hatred. Your mother and I chose to live out here so we could be together without facing that hatred every day." "And me?" Alina asked quietly. "Would they hate me too?" Grisha's eyes filled with tears. Some would, sweetheart, not because of anything you have done, but because you are part orc. It is not fair and it is not right, but it is the truth. Alina sat with that for a long moment, her face serious beyond her years. Then she said, I am glad we live here then. I like the forest. I like our family. I do not need people who would hate me for no reason. You are very wise, Brennan said, his voice thick with emotion. And you should know that not all people are like that. We have friends, good people who see past prejudice. The world is slowly changing. Maybe by the time you are grown it will be different. I hope so, Alina said. But even if it is not, I will be okay, because I have you and Mama and you have taught me to be strong. That night, after Alina had gone to bed, Brennan held Grisha while she cried. She is so young to understand such ugly things, Grisha said. I wanted to protect her from it longer. She is strong like her mother, Brennan said. She can handle the truth, and we will make sure she never doubts that she is loved and valued, no matter what the rest of the world thinks. The seasons turned, as they always did, and Alina grew from a child into a young woman. She was 16 when she told her parents she wanted to see the world beyond the forest, and though it terrified them, they supported her decision. They had taught her everything they could: how to hunt, how to track, how to defend herself, how to read people and situations. They had given her the tools to survive, and now they had to trust that those tools would be enough. I will come back, Alina promised as she prepared to leave on her first journey to a distant settlement. This will always be my home, but I need to see what else is out there. I need to know if the world is really as bad as you have said, or if maybe it has changed. Be careful, Grisha said, hugging her daughter tightly. Trust your instincts, and if anyone tries to hurt you, you run. You run and you come home to us. I will, Alina said. She turned to Brennan. Take care of Mama. She worries too much. I will, Brennan said, embracing her. And you take care of yourself. You are braver than I was at your age. Alina left at dawn, a pack on her back and a knife at her belt, and Brennan and Grisha watched until she disappeared into the trees. Then they went inside and held each other, hoping they had prepared her well enough for what she would face. Alina returned 3 weeks later, travel-worn but safe, her eyes bright with new experiences. She had stories to tell about the settlement she had visited, about the people she had met, some kind and some cruel, about the things she had seen and learned. She had faced prejudice, yes, but she had also found allies. She had met other mixed families, human orc unions that were slowly becoming more common and more accepted. The world was changing, she reported. Slowly, painfully, but it was changing. There is a place for us, Alina said as they sat around the dinner table, just like they had when she was young. Maybe not everywhere, not yet, but there are communities that are trying to be better. Places where people like us can live without hiding. Would you ever want to see them? Brennan and Grisha looked at each other. They had lived in isolation for so long, had built their entire life around avoiding a world that rejected them. The idea of leaving, of risking the safety they had worked so hard to create, was terrifying. But it was also tempting. To live openly, to walk in a town without fear, to have Alina grow up with friends and neighbors, these were things they had never allowed themselves to dream about. Maybe, Brennan said slowly. Maybe someday. But for now, this is still our home. This is where we are happy. Then I will stay too, Alina said. For now, but someday maybe we can all go together, see what the new world looks like. Someday, Grisha agreed, smiling. When we are ready. The years continued their steady march, and life in the cabin remained good. Brennan and Grisha grew older, their hair graying and their bodies bearing the marks of a life lived hard and well. Alina matured into a formidable young woman, strong and skilled and kind like her parents. She made occasional trips to nearby settlements, building relationships and trading, but she always came home, And then one spring, she came home with someone. His name was David, a young human man who worked as a carpenter in one of the more progressive settlements. He was polite and earnest, and he looked at Alina like she hung the moon. More importantly, he did not care that she was part orc. He loved her, wholly and completely, exactly as she was. Brennan was protective, as fathers always are, and he grilled David thoroughly about his intentions and his character. But it was impossible not to like the young man, who was respectful to Grisha and clearly admired Brennan. And when he asked for permission to marry Alina, looking terrified but determined, Brennan found himself saying yes. The wedding was held in the clearing outside the cabin, with a handful of close friends in attendance. It was small and simple, but it was perfect. Alina wore a dress that Grisha had sewn, and David wore his best clothes. They spoke vows that were a blend of human and orcish traditions, promising to love and honor each other in all circumstances. And when they kissed, sealing their union, Brennan pulled Grisha close and whispered, "We did it. We raised a daughter who is brave enough to love openly." "She learned from the best," Grisha whispered back, tears of joy streaming down her face. Alina and David built a house in the settlement where David worked, a place that welcomed mixed families and celebrated diversity. They visited often, bringing news and laughter, and eventually they brought a grandchild, a boy with dark hair and a hint of green to his skin, beautiful and perfect. Brennan held his grandson for the first time and felt a completion he had not known he was missing. This was what they had fought for, what they had built their life around. Not just their own happiness, but the possibility of a future where their children and grandchildren could love freely without fear. "What should we call him?" Alina asked, watching her father cradle the baby. "Whatever you want," Brennan said, "but maybe something that means strength or hope. This boy is both." They named him Marcus, and he became a frequent visitor to the cabin as he grew. Brennan and Grisha taught him the same lessons they had taught Alina: how to survive in the wilderness, how to be kind and strong, how to love without reservation. And they told him stories about how the world used to be and how much it had changed, and how he was part of that change. Brennan was 65 when his health began to fail. It started small: a persistent cough, a weakness in his limbs, a weariness that no amount of rest could cure. Grisha tended him with the same fierce devotion she had always shown, but they both knew what was coming. He was mortal and he had lived a full life. It was time. "I am not afraid," he told Grisha one evening as they lay together in the bed they had shared for so many years. "I have had a good life, a wonderful life. You gave me that. We gave it to each other," Grisha corrected, her voice breaking. "I do not know how to live without you, Brennan. You are my heart." "And you are mine," he said, lifting a trembling hand to cup her face. "But you will be okay. You have Alina and David and Marcus. You have friends. You will grieve, but you will survive because you are the strongest person I have ever known." "I do not feel strong," she whispered. "You are," he insisted. "You survived things that would have broken anyone else. You built a life from nothing. You loved me even when the world said you should not. That takes a strength most people will never understand." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, with Grisha holding his hand. She did not cry immediately. Instead, she sat with him for a long time, memorizing his face, thanking him silently for everything he had given her. Then she went outside and howled her grief to the forest, a long, orcish keen that spoke of love and loss and the unbearable pain of being left behind. Alina came as soon as she heard, and she stayed for weeks, helping her mother through the worst of the grief. They buried Brennan in the clearing, beneath a tall pine where he used to sit and watch the sunset. Grisha carved a marker from stone, etching his name and the words, "He saw me when no one else did." Life continued because it had to. Grisha lived another 15 years, during which she watched Marcus grow into a fine young man and welcomed more grandchildren. The world continued to change around her, becoming more accepting, more open. Mixed families became common, and prejudice, while not gone, lost its teeth. Grisha saw the future she and Brennan had dreamed of start to take shape, and she was grateful. When her time came, she was surrounded by family Alina and David, Marcus and his wife, 3 great-grandchildren who barely remembered a time when humans and orcs did not live side by side. She died in the cabin she had shared with Brennan, in the bed where they had loved and fought and built a life together. Her last words were, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." They buried her beside Brennan, and Alina carved a marker that matched his. She loved when no one said she could. The cabin stood empty for a while, a monument to a love that had changed everything. But eventually, Marcus and his family moved in, maintaining it as both a home and a memorial. They told the story to anyone who would listen, the story of a human scout who saw an orc girl being treated cruelly and decided to do something about it. The story of how kindness and love could overcome prejudice and build something beautiful. And in settlements and towns across the borderlands, people remembered. They told the story to their children, who told it to theirs. It became legend, a reminder that change was possible, that love was stronger than hate, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply seeing another person as human or orc and treating them with the dignity they deserved. The world was not perfect. Prejudice still existed, and there were still places where mixed families faced discrimination. But it was better, much better than it had been. And it continued to improve, one generation at a time, built on the foundation that people like Brennan and Grisha had laid. Their love story became a beacon, proof that different worlds could collide and create something stronger than either alone. It inspired countless others to be brave, to love across boundaries, to stand up against injustice. And though they were gone, their impact lived on, rippling outward through time, touching lives they would never know in the end. That was their legacy, not just the family they created, but the change they sparked. They had started with a simple act of kindness, a man making sure a hungry woman had food to eat. From that small beginning, everything else had flowed. Love, partnership, family, revolution. All because Brennan noticed the orc girl always served him first and ate nothing, and he made her sit down and eat, and the world was better for it.